You mess with my crime time family, you'll end up in one of our videos, huh? I'm your host Yusuf, and these are the top 10 chilling things you didn't know about Al Capone. Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell to get notified whenever we upload a new video. Anyways, Vinny, take them away! Number 10, the temper. Capone prided himself on keeping his temper under wraps, but when friend and fellow hood Jack Guzik was assaulted by a small-time thug, Capone tracked the assailant down and shot him until he departed in a bar. Due to a lack of witnesses, Capone got away with the cold-blooded execution, but the publicity surrounding the case gave him a notoriety that he never had before. Capone spent his early years hanging around the docks along the Brooklyn Navy Yard around his home. He was a good student in his youth, but at the age of 14, while attending PS 133, Capone struck a teacher in the face. According to some accounts, Capone was expelled. According to others, he left the school himself. Whatever the case, he never went back. Number 9, the Massacre. Capone also had to deal with rival gangster Bugs Moran and his Northsiders gang, who had been a threat for years. Moran had even once tried to end Capone's colleague and friend, Jack McGurn. The decision by Capone and McGurn to avail themselves of Moran was to lead one of the most infamous gangland massacres in history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On Thursday, February 14th, 1929, at 10:30 in the morning, Moran and his gang were lured by a bootlegger into a garage to buy whiskey.
Yeah, hello. Mr. Kane. He just stepped out. Any message?
Yeah. Tell him his shirts is ready.
McGurn's men would be waiting for them dressed in stolen police uniforms, the idea being that they would stage a fake raid. McGurn, like Capone, made sure he was far away and checked into a hotel with his girlfriend. When McGurn's men thought they saw Moran, they got into their police uniforms and drove over to the garage in a stolen police car. Which were easy to get in the 20s, I guess. The bootleggers, caught in the act, lined up against the wall. McGurn's men took the bootleggers' guns and opened fire with 2 machine guns.
Hello, boys. Something I can do for you?
Yeah, you can shut up. I'll line up, all of you. Face that wall.
All the men except Frank Gusenberg were slain outright in cold blood. The plan appeared to go brilliantly, except for one major detail. Moran was not among the men. Moran had seen the police car and took off, not wanting to be caught up in the raid.
Lousy cops. They sure picked a swell time to get nosy.
Hell of a note if Sorella shows up with the booze with them still in there. Let's get a cup of coffee.
Yeah, I could use one.
Even though Capone was conveniently in Florida, the police and the newspapers knew who staged the massacre. Number 8, the dinners.
This is the time for what? For individual achievement.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became a national media event, immortalizing Capone as the most ruthless, feared, smartest, and elegant of gangland bosses. Even while powerful forces were amassing against him, Capone indulged in one last bloody act of revenge, the removal of 2 Sicilian colleagues whom he believed had betrayed him. Capone invited his victims to a sumptuous banquet, where he brutally pulverized them with a baseball bat.
I get nowhere unless the team wins.
Team.
Capone had observed the old tradition of wining and dining traitors before executing them. It's like a last meal while on the execution penalty, but so much more gruesome. Somewhat ironically, it was the pen pushers from the tax office who posed the greatest threat to the gangsters' bootlegging empires. In May 1927, the Supreme Court ruled that a bootlegger had to pay income tax on his illegal bootlegging business. With such a ruling, it wasn't long before the small special intelligence unit of the IRS under Elmer Eyre was able to go after Capone. Number 7, the Scar. Under Torrio's tutelage, Capone was introduced to Brooklyn racketeer Frankie Yale, aka Frankie Uel. He hired Capone as a bartender and occasional bouncer at the Coney Island dance hall and saloon he owned called the Harvard Inn. Kinda funny, Frankie Yale owns the Harvard Inn? I'm sorry. The story goes that while working there, Capone allegedly insulted the sister of a local petty felon named Frank Galluccio, who promptly slashed him with a pocket knife across the face 3 times. But a reporter found a December 1918 article in the Brooklyn Daily Times that said one Alfonso Capone was approached by 2 men and had his cheek slashed by a knife, though the paper gets the side of the face wrong. Alongside other evidence, the reporter speculates that Capone had insulted Galluccio's sister at a different dance hall, and then Galluccio found Capone at a restaurant and attacked him. No matter what happened, the healed wounds eventually led to Capone's infamous Scarface name, a moniker he did not care for. He preferred to be called Snorky by his closest friends, a reference to his fashion sense. Later, Capone told people he sustained the 3 scars from shrapnel while fighting in France during WW1, even though he had not actually gone there. Number 6, The Move. There are 2 stories about how Capone ended up in Chicago. According to one, it was because Capone had assaulted a member of a rival gang called the White Hand, which warned them that there would be retribution. This prompted Yale to send Capone and his family west to work for Torrio, who had moved to the Windy City to work for Chicago outfit kingpin James Big Jim Colosimo in 1909. This doesn't sound a lot like Capone's idea though. I mean, come on, do you guys think Capone would move to Chicago to avoid conflict? He doesn't seem that emotionally intelligent to me. According to the other theory, Capone moved because Torrio wanted his protege to be his underboss. Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919 shortly after, and Colosimo perished with either Capone or Yale doing the whacking, and Torrio became the boss. Number 5, The Bat.
Baseball.
Capone usually had his minions do his dirty work, but sometimes he took matters into his own hands. Take, for example, when a Sicilian mobster named Joe Aiello persuaded some of Capone's own Chicago outfit gangsters, Albert Anselmi, John Scalise, and Joseph Giunta, to overthrow the gangster, and one of Capone's bodyguards, Frank Rio, uncovered the plot. As author John Kobler writes in Capone, The Life and World of Al Capone, Scarface invited the men to the dinner, the traditional hospitality before execution. When the meal was over, he revealed to them that he knew about their treachery. Then, Capone's bodyguards tied the men to their chairs, and Capone stood up, grabbing a baseball bat. Slowly, he walked the length of the table and halted behind the first guest of honor. With both hands, he lifted the bat and slammed it down full force. Slowly, methodically, he struck again and again, breaking bones in the man's shoulders, arms, and chest. He moved to the next man, and when he was reduced to mangled flesh and bone, to the third. One of the bodyguards then fetched his revolver from the check room and shot each man in the back of the head. Gross. Capone just turns people into mincemeat, I guess. Number 4, The Money. After arriving in Chicago, Capone worked for Torrio, who was part of a criminal network headed by a man named Big Jim Colosimo. When Colosimo was removed, possibly as a hit ordered by Torrio and carried out by Capone's former boss Frankie Yale, Torrio took over as boss and made Capone one of his key aides. In January 1925, Torrio was gunned down outside his Illinois home. He survived the attack but left Chicago later that year, choosing 26-year-old Capone as his replacement. Capone expanded the outfit, as he referred to his underworld organization, and went on to become one of America's leading mobsters. By some estimates, his crime syndicate pulled in around $100 million a year, the largest portion from bootlegging, followed by gambling, streetwalking, racketeering, and other illicit activities. A flashy dresser who liked chatting with reporters and became an international celebrity, Capone didn't apologize for the way he made his living. He claimed to be doing a public service for Chicagoans, stating, "90% of the people of Cook County drink and gamble, and my offense has been to furnish them with those amusements." Number 3, The Conviction. Although he controlled a criminal empire and ordered hits on a multitude of his enemies, Capone managed to avoid prosecution for years by paying off police and public officials and threatening witnesses. The mob boss finally was slapped with his first criminal conviction in May 1929, after he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon in Philadelphia. At the time, he was on his way back to Chicago following a summit of organized crime honchos in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and swiftly sentenced to a year in jail. He was freed in March 1930, and a month later, the Chicago Crime Commission released its first ever list of the city's worst criminals. Capone was named public enemy number 1. Meanwhile, on orders from President Herbert Hoover to nail Capone, the federal government built a case against the crime boss for income tax fraud, and in June 1931, he was indicted on charges of tax evasion. Capone agreed to a plea deal that included a recommended prison sentence of 2.5 years. However, the judge in the case refused to accept the deal. Capone withdrew his guilty plea and the case went to trial. At the start of the highly publicized proceedings, the judge switched out the pool of prospective jurors after learning bribes had been offered in an effort to seat a Capone-friendly jury. In October 1931, the all-male jury, Illinois didn't allow female jurors until 1939, found the gangster guilty of 5 charges, 3 felonies and 2 misdemeanors, of the more than 20 counts against him. He was sentenced to 11 years behind bars and fined $50,000. It was the harshest sentence delivered for tax fraud up to that point. Number 2, the island. In May 1932, 33-year-old Capone began his sentence for tax evasion at the US Penitentiary in Atlanta. 2 years later, in August 1934, he and a group of fellow inmates were sent by train to California, then transported to the recently opened federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The maximum security prison, intended to hold criminals who were especially violent or had other disciplinary problems, had received its first contingent of federal inmates earlier that August. Because Capone wasn't a troublemaker while locked up in Atlanta, he likely was sent to Alcatraz as a way for the government to generate publicity for its tough new facility. While at Alcatraz, Capone, who had been diagnosed with syphilis during a medical exam at the Atlanta Penitentiary, started showing signs of the disease, including dementia. As his condition worsened, prison doctors treated him with malaria injections in the hope that the fevers caused by malaria would wipe out the syphilis. Instead, the treatment nearly proved fatal for Capone. In January 1939, he was released from Alcatraz and transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island, near Los Angeles, to serve his 1-year misdemeanor sentence. Number 1, the disease. Capone was released from prison in November 1939, then underwent several months of treatment for syphilis at a Baltimore hospital. Afterward, the famous gangster spent much of his time out of the public spotlight, fishing and playing cards at the Palm Island, Florida mansion he'd owned since 1928. In the 1940s, he became one of the first civilians to receive penicillin for syphilis, although it was too late to cure him. In January 1947, the 48-year-old Capone suffered a stroke, then came down with pneumonia. He passed away at his Florida home on January 25th. Capone was buried at Chicago's Mount Olivet Cemetery near the graves of his father and one of his brothers. In 1950, the Capone family had the remains of the 3 men moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Thanks for watching. Leave a like and comment if you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you next time on Crime Time.